They did not send a general. They did not send an admiral or a senator or even the ambassador's deputy. When the Kalari Assembly's final invitation arrived, one more session, in the chamber, before the long silence, every qualified human negotiator was already there, and had been there in various configurations for 6 years. Myra Osai was 8 years old, and she was only in the room because her mother was the translator and the babysitter had canceled that morning. And no one had thought to arrange a replacement for what was assumed, by then, to be a formality. A closing. The war had exhausted its own vocabulary. The chamber smelled like ozone and cold metal, because Kalari found human body heat physically uncomfortable and kept the air 2 degrees above freezing out of what they called courtesy, and what human staff privately called something closer to punishment. Myra sat on the floor against the wall, in her coat, drawing on the back of a briefing folder while adults argued in 2 languages about a border neither side had ever fully agreed existed. She had been in that gallery, or one like it, more than 40 times across 6 years. Her mother had never found reliable childcare for a job that convened without warning and sometimes ran 14 hours. So Myra had grown up doing homework in observation rooms while translators worked, watching through glass at an age when most children were watching cartoons. She knew the shape of failure by the time she was 6. She knew it had a particular rhythm. A human delegate would propose something. A Kalari arbiter would decline it in formal, layered language. A human aide would translate the decline into something shorter and angrier than intended, and the room would reset itself for the next round, sometimes hours later, sometimes the next week. What Myra had never been told, what none of the human negotiators had ever been told, because the assembly had never once considered it relevant to say, was that Kalari negotiation protocol was 300 years older than humanity's written language, and that it contained a clause written for children. 6 years of human diplomats had asked the assembly 100 different versions of the same question. What do you want? What will resolve this? What terms end the conflict? 6 years of answers had circled the same 11 square kilometers of disputed terrain. No water, no mineral metal, no strategic elevation, nothing a resource analyst could explain on a slide. Human intelligence had run 4 separate assessments on why the assembly wanted it, and each had returned some version of unknown, possibly symbolic, possibly a negotiating anchor with no intrinsic value. Nobody had asked why in a way the assembly was permitted to answer, because nobody who asked had ever qualified. War Arbiter Thescorn had pale gray plating and eyes the color of wet slate, and he had spent 6 years listening to humans explain, in increasingly desperate configurations, why they deserved to keep what they had. He was not cruel. He was, by the 3rd hour of that final session, simply finished, a specific, weary kind of finished that 400 years of institutional patience had not fully prepared him for. When the session reached its 3rd hour, he said the sentence the translators had been dreading since morning, that the assembly saw no further purpose in continuing to speak, and that the long silence would be recorded at the close of this session. Myra looked up from her folder and said, "Can I ask you something?" The room went quiet in the specific way rooms go quiet when a child has said something at the exact wrong moment. Her mother reached for her, already forming an apology in Kalari formal register. Thescorn did not move. He did not move because he could not move. Kalari negotiation protocol bound an arbiter to answer, fully and without evasion, any sincere question asked by a party who held no rank, no weapon, and no procedural agenda in the room. The clause had been written for Kalari children 300 years earlier, because the Assembly's founding doctrine held that a species willing to lie to its own young was a species already dead, whatever else it claimed to be. No human had ever triggered the clause. Every human who had sat in that chamber across 6 years had qualified as something else first: negotiator, aide, translator with a stake in the outcome, soldier attending as escort. Myra qualified as nothing. She held no title. She had wandered in holding a folder and a box of colored pencils. Thescorn's own translator went still in the particular way Kalari staff went still when something had shifted on their side of the table that the human side had not yet understood. He said something short. In the clipped internal register the assembly used only among itself, and Thescorn's plating changed color. Not the shade humans had learned meant irritation, but a paler one none of the human staff had a name for yet, because in 6 years they had never seen it. "You may ask," Thescorn said, because it was the only sentence available to him now. Myra's mother said her daughter's name once quietly, the way parents say a child's name when they are trying to stop something without making it worse in front of a room full of people whose patience has already been spent. Myra ignored her. She had spent 6 years in that gallery watching how Thescorn's plating shifted when he was annoyed by a proposal, and how it shifted differently when a proposal genuinely surprised him. And right now it was doing the second thing, and she was more interested in that than in being quiet. "Why do you want the border to move there?" Myra said, and pointed at a map no one had shown her, the one she had been copying onto the back of the folder for 3 hours, not because she understood its politics, but because she liked the shape of the coastline. "It doesn't get you anything. I checked. There's no water there and no metal and nobody lives there. You could have asked for the part with the metal in it and we probably would have said yes." "I checked" meant she had been listening to 3 hours of resource assessments, the way other children listen to weather reports. Half attentive, retaining more than anyone assumed a bored 8-year-old would retain. The silence that followed was not the political kind. It did not have the shape of the silences that usually followed a proposal, the ones both sides used to calculate what the other side would accept. This silence had the shape of a species deciding, in real time, how much truth a single question had actually earned. Thescorn did not answer for 4 seconds, which the eventual transcript would flag as unusually long for him. Kalari silence before speech was never hesitation in the human sense. It was the sound of an answer being assembled, layer by protocol layer, to make sure it did not exceed what the question had rightfully purchased. Then he told her. The territory contained nothing of resource value. That had never been the point, and every human assessment across 6 years had been correct about the absence of anything worth extracting and wrong about what that absence meant. 200 years earlier, before humanity had radio, let alone contact, a Kalari survey vessel had suffered catastrophic engine failure in that exact region. 41 crew. No distress signal had reached anyone in time. The wreck had settled into ground that fell, after human settlement 2 centuries later, inside a border humanity now administered and had no memory of, no knowledge of, no reason to ever have connected to a war over 11 empty square kilometers. The assembly had never been permitted to recover it. Not because humanity had refused, humanity had never been asked, because Kalari Protocol forbade a war arbiter from citing grief as a negotiating position. Grief was not a resource. It could not be weighed against water rights or mineral ore in a formal proceeding, and an arbiter who tried to introduce it as leverage would be relieved of the seat for corrupting the process with something the assembly considered too important to be used as a bargaining chip. So for 6 years, Thescorn had argued about coordinates because he was structurally, doctrinally forbidden from saying the only true sentence available to him. "My people are still out there, and I want to bring them home." He said this to an 8-year-old because she was the first person in 6 years to ask him a real question instead of asking him for something. Myra thought about it the way children think about things adults have spent years failing to say plainly, turning it over without the layers of caution an adult would have added. "You could have just told us that." "I could not," Thescorn said, and something in his voice had gone unfamiliar even to his own staff, softer, unpracticed, a register none of them had a transcript for. "Grief has no standing. It is not a claim I am permitted to make in this chamber." "It's not a claim," Myra said. "It's just true. You're allowed to say true things." Her mother would say, much later, that this was the exact moment she understood the war was going to end that afternoon, not because of anything strategic in the room, but because her daughter had said the sentence like it was obvious, the way children say things that adults have spent years making complicated on purpose, layering procedure over a fact simple enough to fit on the back of a folder. Thescorn did not answer immediately. 400 years old, 4th-generation war arbiter, and no human had ever offered him permission before. He looked, for the first time in 6 years of sessions, like someone doing arithmetic he had never expected to need. What followed did not resemble any treaty draft either side's staff had prepared for that afternoon. The human delegation, still recalibrating, offered full access to the coordinates within the hour, not as a concession weighed against anything, but because once the actual reason for wanting them was on the table, weighing it against anything felt, even to career negotiators, obscene. Recovery of the wreck took 6 weeks and cost humanity nothing but clearance and patience. The disputed territory itself reverted to joint administration inside a month, not because either side had won it in the way 6 years of sessions had assumed a winner would eventually emerge, but because neither side wanted it once the real reason for wanting it no longer needed to hide behind coordinates. Thescorn's formal report to the Assembly listed the resolution as achieved through unranked correspondence. The closest a war arbiter is permitted to come, in writing, to admitting he had been undone by a child with a box of colored pencils, and a question no one senior enough to matter had thought to ask in 6 years. The Assembly's internal response took longer to arrive than the treaty had. Kalari institutions moved carefully around anything that implicated the founding doctrine, and a war arbiter setting 6 years of failed proceedings down in front of an unranked human child was, by any reasonable reading, an indictment of every ranked party who had sat in that chamber before her, including, if anyone wanted to be precise about it, Thescorn himself. He did not defend himself in the report. He simply recorded what had been asked, and what the protocol had obligated him to answer, and let the Assembly draw its own conclusions about 6 years spent circling a question a child needed 40 seconds to arrive at. He sent Myra, separately, a small carved piece of the Rex outer plating, through channels that took 4 ministries and a fair amount of internal argument to approve, because nothing in Kalari human protocol had a category for a war arbiter sending a personal object to an 8-year-old civilian. There was no message attached. Kalari did not write personal messages easily, and Thescorn, least of all 400 years of formal register, did not leave room for casual sentiment, and he would not have known how to begin one even if the Assembly's channels had allowed it. But the plating was polished on one side, which was not standard for salvage transfers, and someone on the human side who understood Kalari customs better than the negotiating staff had, quietly explained to Myra's mother that polishing a piece of the dead by hand, before giving it away, was the closest a Kalari came to saying thank you out loud. Myra kept it on her windowsill. She was, within a week, mostly back to being 8 years old, mostly uninterested in the diplomatic aftermath that occupied her mother's evenings for months afterward, mostly interested in whether the plating caught the morning light the way she'd noticed it had in the chamber. When Thescorn had turned it over in his hands like something he still could not quite believe he had been given permission to grieve out loud. Her mother, for her part, kept a copy of the session transcript long after the official archive had absorbed it into 6 years of other records. Not because of the treaty terms, which were straightforward enough by the time lawyers finished with them. She kept it because of the 4 seconds of silence before Thescorn answered. The length of time, she came to think, that it takes a very old and very careful species to decide that a true thing, said plainly, does not need to be defended.